Social welfare. Social welfare was also developing systematically during the 1800s. There were two women during this time that were instrumental to bringing about change. They were Dorothy Dix and Jane Addams. Dorothy Dix was well known for crusading on behalf of the insane, the poor, and criminals. She championed the causes of prison inmates, the mentally ill, and the poor. Her work began when she volunteered to teach Sunday class for women inmates in the East Cambridge jail. She noticed horrific experiences for the inmates, which included crowded, unheated, unfurnished, and despicable smelling quarters. Many of the inmates, aside from being criminals, were also mentally ill. And when she asked why the jails was in such current state of conditions, she was told that the insane do not feel heat or cold. Eventually, due to Dorothy's conviction and passion of improving the environment conditions of inmates, the legislature agreed to provide support and set aside funds for the expansion of state hospitals. As a result of her work, by 1843, there were 13 mental hospitals in the country, and by 1880, there were 123 hospitals. Dix's work changed the thinking of the time. While most people during this time believed that the mentally ill could not be treated, Dorothy understood that people could get better if their environmental conditions got better. During the Industrial Revolution of the late 1800s, hundreds of thousands of people immigrated to the United States seeking a better quality of life. Another person interested in meeting the social welfare needs of people were Jane Addams. She founded Hull House as a settlement house to assist these immigrants to adjust to their new homeland. The criminal justice system. During this time, we also saw changes in the criminal justice system as well. Based on the results of scientific studies, criminals who demonstrated signs of rehabilitations were being released from prison before the terms of their sentence were up. The Elmira Reformatory in Pennsylvania was the first U.S. prison to use the practice of time off for good behavior. As we move on to the 20th century, we also saw during this time an increase in government involvement, an increase in scientific studies, especially as it related to poverty. Also, there was a stable governmental agency created to deal with mental health, social welfare, criminal justice, and education. And there was also creation of the Department of Health and Human Services. There are many mental health models that human services professionals use to assist their clients. Some of the mental health models I want you to become familiar with are Carl Rogers, person-centered therapy, crisis intervention, behaviorism, family therapy, Gestalt and reality therapy, cognitive therapy, managed care and HMOs, the deinstitutionalization of community management and treatment. I want you to know the Community Mental Health Act of 1963, the grassroots movements for nonprofits, and managed care and cognitive behavioral therapies at that time. And this spans, quite a length of time to the 1940s to current. And these are basically during each individual decades, certain therapies that were popular at the time. So we still use some of these therapies today to alleviate some of the mental health challenges that people have, especially cognitive therapy that's used quite frequently. Family therapy, of course, are still used during this time. Social welfare continued to grow at this time in the 20th century. So in the 20th century, social welfare has undergone many changes since the days of orphanages, settlement houses, and charity wards in hospitals. During the Great Depression of the late 1920s and 1930s, Franklin D. Roosevelt's New Deal provided people in need of food, clothing, and other basic necessities of life, and also created work programs for people so that they can earn a living wage. And also in the 1960s, President Lyndon Johnson waged a war on poverty, resulting in the passage of the 1964 Economic Opportunity Act, which created such programs as affirmative action, welfare, food stamps, low-cost housing, and federally funded medical insurance. This led to employment of thousands of social workers and a formal study of the social welfare programs in colleges. Prison and education reform. The 20th century brought about reform to U.S. prison systems. In response to substantiated proof that there is a direct relationship among poverty, violence, and criminal behavior, the prison system has begun to focus on more humanistic approaches to rehabilitation. Probation and parole programs were set up to allow probationers and parolees to live in a society under the supervision of human services workers who monitored their behaviors. Educational reform also progressed during the 20th century. Although mandatory education had been around for a while, the quality of education was in no way the same for every child living in the United States. In the 1950s and the 1960s, Martin Luther King Jr. and other civil rights leaders campaigned for an equal quality of education for minorities. It wasn't until the 1950s and even into the 1960s and 1970s, in some places, Blacks and whites in the South were not allowed to attend the same schools. Civil rights movements of the 1960s focused nationally on the inequalities and abuses brought about by the segregation and racism. Public schools throughout the country slowly became integrated. Eventually, state governments began passing legislation that funded special programs in public schools so that the learning disabled and children with intellectual disabilities, as well as children with physical limitation, could be provided with the same educational opportunities as their peers. These growing programs required public school system to hire more human services workers to evaluate each student's needs and to provide counseling to them and their families.